Pastor Robert Fergusson. Thanks for being here today.
Look, it's as I said, a huge honor to chat across the world.
That's right. You're broadcasting from Sydney. We're in Montana. We're meeting in the middle through the power of the internet.
Yes. Oh my gosh, we're so grateful for you.
Where you guys are having long days, we are in the shortest days until December 21st. Our days get shorter and shorter and shorter. It's like the sun just comes up and is like, just kidding, and then goes away right now.
I know. Well, in Sydney, it's not quite as bad as or as good as being in other parts of the world. Though we do have extended days, but I came from England originally, and in summertime the days go on for ages, and then in winter, of course, they're greatly shortened. So a little like you, I suspect.
Yes.
And are you out and about? Do you have outdoor pursuits that you enjoy recreationally?
To be honest, I've always tried to avoid contact sports. All my friends who are my age have dodgy knees because they insist on playing sports, whereas I just go for long walks.
That's awesome.
Well, that's good. That's good
You
for your
and
heart.
is that something you and Amanda do together?
Yeah, actually, in this season, because we have been shut in our homes like the rest of the world, I've actually sought to do things that I probably wouldn't do. So we have a park nearby, and I've fed my soul each day with, we've gone for a walk together and in the park and just engaged with the beauty of the world. And that has been hugely important for my soul.
I
Wow. I
love that
love how you said
language.
that. Yeah. Feeding your soul. I love that. It's
Yeah,
beautiful.
you and your wife have been married 44 years.
44 years. Yep.
That is
Wow.
incredible. We
We
have to
still
stop
love each
and
other.
that. There you go. And you've survived a quarantine together, 2020 together. What did you guys learn of marriage in the pandemic?
Well, look, we're actually both introverts, so we've always we've always enjoyed not just our peace and quiet, but our own space. So we're so used to it that we just go to different rooms if we want to, if we want to be on our own. So we're not one of those people that are stuck in a little unit just with two people and three kids. We've got a bit of space in our house, so we can go to different rooms and just yeah.
Now, you and I
That's
share a
amazing.
mutual love for Winston Churchill, which we will talk about that because some of my favorite moments of your new book do involve Winston. But you have you heard he said the secret to a good marriage is never speak to each other before noon if you can avoid it.
Yeah, well, look, I've followed that advice. One of the things that we do, my wife is really good in the morning. She just jumps out of bed as if this was just the best day in the world, and I take at least 2 hours to begin to function. So to talk to you
Same.
today, because it's early in the morning, I had to get up an extra hour early so that I could have a sensible conversation with you. So I followed Winston Churchill's advice, and I never talk to my wife at breakfast. In fact, we have routines that she and I eat breakfast together in different, separately in different rooms, and we don't really talk to each other until we've done all our normal routines, devotions, and so on. And then I may, after about an hour and a half, say, "So, did you sleep well?"
See, that is so funny.
That's
Well,
amazing.
I think that's what you're describing is you guys have come to a rhythm. Obviously, it's worked 44
Yeah.
years, and you guys have a
Right.
beautiful relationship and a
Yeah.
beautiful marriage. But I think when you're first married, you have this picture in your head of we have to do everything together all the time, and I think there does come a necessary figuring out your dynamics, your personalities, what brings you life, and two introverts marrying. That's what's working for you guys.
Wow.
Yeah, and I think we're all on a journey of discovery. I think I'm still learning things about myself. I'm still learning things about my wife. I think when a season like this comes, it gives you opportunity to reflect and get some more information and learn how to work together better. I was told when I first got married, as you said, people told me if you won't pray together, you won't stay together. Well, to be honest, we've never prayed together. We find it very difficult to pray together. We pray separately and we talk all the time about spiritual things, but actually sitting down and praying together has never been our habit. So the key is that you both love God together, but you don't necessarily have to do every aspect of life exactly the same. So I think, as you say, you learn what's important, what are the priorities, what works for you, what works for you as a couple. I think those are just part of the fun learning curves in life.
Wow, that's so helpful and so freeing because I feel like there, like you said, there is that expectation of like, oh, you have to do this and this and this and this and this. But it's like, that is not the case. And that is just so freeing to know like every couple's different. God is going to lead every couple differently. And that's just beautiful.
I can literally hear people listening to this podcast sighing a sigh of relief, like, oh, that is incredible. Because you see these Instagram pictures of pastors and their wives, like, we pray 3 hours every day. It's like, but what you said, you said we pray separately and we walk with God together.
Yeah, that's pretty much
beautiful.
And look, I think you've got to realize that we are spirit, soul, and body. We often put it in the other way around. People talk about our body, soul, and spirit, and actually that is everything in reverse. You're putting your physical needs first, your soul needs second, and your spiritual needs last. The Bible says it's spirit, soul, body, and each of those areas need to be fed and looked after and cared for. And just like when you're on a plane, you're told to wear a mask before you help other people. You've got to look after yourself before you can help the people around you. So I very intentionally feed my spirit, feed my soul, and feed my body the way it should be fed in that order. And suddenly you become a better human being, better able to love your wife, your husband, your children. And if people just did that and that alone, I think we'd have a better life.
Amen.
That's great. Let's
wow.
drill down on this for a moment. What would you, for the person listening who's like, okay, hold on a second. What's the difference between a spirit and a soul? And how can that understanding change the way they look at their own personal needs?
Yeah, it's actually an interesting distinction because the Bible says it's very difficult to separate them. But the simple way to describe it is that our spirit is that part of us with which we have a relationship with God. God is spirit. He speaks to us in our spirit. We know we're Christians because of our spirit. But our soul, and we can read about this in Psalm 42, is that part of our being with which we think, with which we choose, and with which we feel. So if we don't get that part right, we'll feel bad, choose bad, think bad. And then our body, obviously, contains all of those things. And we need to sleep, we need to eat, we need to do all of those things. But in a church world, we're very good at spirit. We encourage people to pray and do all those right things, sing, and we're pretty good at going to the gym. What we're terrible at is looking after our soul. And that's why we make such bad decisions, why we feel bad all the time, and our thinking is messed up. So we have to be intentionally feeding our soul, whatever that looks like for you, and it will look different for each person.
So you mentioned being at the park helps you feed your soul, and that is going to be whether it's solitude or a bunch of friends, or whatever. It's going to be different for everybody, but your soul gets fed. I heard Dr. Tony Evans say once that your spirit's how you interact with God, your soul's how you interact with yourself, and your body is how you interact with the world around you at large. It's interesting just to think about that.
Yeah, I think you interact with the world with your soul. So I think again, everybody's tried to come up with a definition, but I think your soul is perhaps more important than we're giving it credit. And what you say is absolutely right. Some people love crowds. They love sport. They love the big arenas. They're desperately missing it in this season. Whereas I love reading. I can just sit and read all day. I don't listen to music. I know that may shock you from Hillsong Church, but music doesn't interest me. Other people have to have music. So the key is to discover what feeds you. I nearly had an emotional breakdown when I was started in Australia in 1991. And I realized that I was feeding my spirit and my body, but not my soul. And I changed the whole of my diary. I emptied my diary and rewrote it so that it would feed every part of my being.
Now, when you use the word diary, people are probably, in America at least, confused
Sorry.
because we say calendar, we say
Calendar.
schedule. But diary. So when you're saying you rearranged your events of your
My
schedule.
calendar.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I stopped my appointments completely, and then I put in the things that would feed me. So every morning I do a devotional time, I do journaling. And in this season, incidentally, every morning I take communion.
Oh, beautiful.
Just
Wow.
a little addition. So I have very, very strict rhythms in the morning. And then I put in appointments with people, like Friday night with my wife, or Monday lunch with my wife, or Monday afternoon with my children, whatever it looked like. And I set those in place so that when people rang up and said, could you meet me on Friday night? I'd say, I'm really sorry, I've got another appointment. I didn't say that I was having a chat, watching a movie with my wife. I just said I can't because I'm booked. But what that meant was that I set the pace instead of being forced to do things. And that made all the difference.
Wow. That's beautiful.
Sounds like you're saying, it's important to have a budget for your time, just like you need to have a budget for your dollars and how you spend
Yeah.
your money.
And look, a rhythm. I was brought up on a farm in the south of England. So what I realized is that every farm has a seasonal rhythm. There are 4 seasons, and you negotiate the seasons. Spring is about hope. Summer is about fruitfulness. Autumn is about, or fall is about loss. And winter is about waiting. And that cycle continues all the way through the year. But they also have monthly rhythms. They have daily rhythms. It doesn't matter whether it's cold or hot. They milk the cows. They collect the eggs from the hens. And so I realized that what I needed to do is just follow the agricultural rhythms and have daily, weekly, monthly, annual rhythms. And I call them rhythms, not routines, because there's an ease to it if you get it right.
Wow, what do you make of the season that we're in now? I mean, and what the Holy Spirit's saying to the church now, and seed time and harvest, and obviously there are seasons that the world can find itself in. With what we're facing today, what do you hear God saying to His bride?
Look, I'm very, very cautious about making judgments about what is happening in the world. God is still good. He is still building his church. He's still extending his kingdom. I'm not going to make judgments about why things are happening. What I've been asking is, we are in this season, so what do we need to do? I think we need to look after ourselves, and perhaps I've noticed lots of people have been falling apart in this season: mental well-being, physical well-being, spiritual well-being. And that usually is an indicator, as I said, that we haven't been doing life as we should. So this year has given me pause to challenge myself and others. How are we living? Can we maintain this pace and this rhythm in our life? And the other thing, that when we're in a season like this, not only do we reflect on ourselves, but we reflect on what we can do for others. Because people are so messed up, we need to look after them better. So I don't know about you, but in our church, we have really upped the care for the poor. We've really upped the care for people's mental well-being. The pastoral calls, we've literally made tens of thousands of pastoral calls in this season that perhaps we wouldn't have done before. But I think after this season, we will continue to do it. So I think a year like this gives us a reflection. Why do I do what I do? What am I doing? And how can I do it better?
Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah, so helpful.
What else do you think that has been implemented in this time that you hope continues on once the world is back on its dizzying little way and we're back at NBA games and all the rest?
Well, I hope all of us will have learnt and then put into practice what we've learnt. But look, when this year started and everybody talked about the threat, I made a decision that crisis is either a threat or an opportunity. And I saw it as an opportunity. So here am I talking to you, wonderful people, the other side of the world. And we, all the way through this year, have been doing all our lectures on Zoom, all our contact through Zoom. And to be honest, I have contacted and spoken in nations and to people that I would never have done before. So I'm talking to you this morning, and this afternoon I'm recording a message for Canada and another message for Germany, because I haven't had the opportunity to go there this year.
Wow.
But I think in the future, a lot of people are going to be thinking, well, do we need to travel quite as much? Can we have a meeting like this instead? There's all sorts of ways that we can learn. So we've started an online campus here, and thousands of people are joining up from many countries that we haven't been able to reach, or people can't come. So we're starting a college in Africa, for instance, because a lot of people in African countries can't come to Australia to go to Bible college. So we're going to them. And I think those are the kinds of things that all of us can do in the future, that we can all learn.
That's right.
It's incredible.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah, it's either an opportunity or a threat. And I think, the chance to pivot, the chance to there's ministry moves to be made here. Never is it more important for us to do what we're doing than in the midst of a time of uncertainty, division. Obviously, it has felt a bit like a decathlon this year, that every month it's like, oh, I didn't know I had to shot put next. I thought this was a marathon. And then, for us in America, this election, and it just has felt like it's never going to end. But in the midst of it all, the hope shines forth in the midst of darkness, right?
Yeah.
Look, we've been praying for you guys because you've had a really tough year. You've had a tough year politically. You've had a tough year with the Black Lives Matter. So there's been division in the country. You've had a tough year with COVID. People have lost their jobs. And look, and it seems to be, as you say, one hit after another. But God is still on the throne. And in the book that I've put out, as you know, there's a chapter called Unseen Roots. And the fact is, God promises us storms. He says storms will come. But the key is what we have been doing in the last 10 years to establish roots in our life that will enable us to stand in the tough times. And I think many people are discovering that their lives are relatively shallow and not deep, and we should dig deeper so that when the tough times come, we will stand firm.
Amen.
Jeez.
Wow.
I can just sense people getting encouraged listening to that.
Yeah.
Well, you referenced it, but I do want to recommend this to everybody. Those of you who are watching on video later can see I'm holding in my hands. Are You Getting This? Is it the first book? Is it the first book you've written?
No, it isn't actually. But I don't want to talk about the other one because it wasn't very good.
Gotcha.
I'm sure it's
well,
amazing.
the best book. We'll say the latest book. That you've
latest.
Written.
That's
those
right.
of you who are listening, you'll have to Google it. It's a hefty book, Robert. I mean, this book is not. It's not like it doesn't land like a little pamphlet. This thing, I mean, it's 400 pages long. It's beautiful. Your eyes got cut off. The editor does not like your eyes, so it's right up the nose.
It was the beautiful artwork, but I actually rather like it. It's because it's about communication. Yeah. And specifically about preaching. And so when we're in the pulpit, it is half, Paul's put it like this in 2 Corinthians 4:5. He says, I'm not going to preach anything except Jesus. And then he said, and myself. So when you're in the pulpit, you're actually in partnership. So I rather like the fact that it's a picture of me on the front, but cut off. So
I
that,
love it.
So that people it's not, in other words, it is about me, but it isn't about me.
Yeah, I intend to purchase a copy of this for all of my pastors on staff here at Fresh Life, our pastors. I love this. I read it in a sitting. I recommend this to anybody listening who does preach, obviously, but that would be just the beginning of who I'd recommend it to, because the subtitle is Teaching, Preaching, and Storytelling. And that's really more the heartbeat of this book, is the power and the particulars of storytelling, of which you make the case that should be at the center of preaching, because that's how the Lord preached. But this is a book that if someone's a kindergarten teacher, that they would find benefit from, in my opinion. Anybody who wants to do good in business needs, story is king, as the Pixar people say. And so I just would, it caught me off guard. I mean, you're a romantic, you're a deep soul, so I knew whatever you wrote would be good. But this really is a master class in how to communicate.
Wow.
Well, you're very gracious, very kind. I think I wrote it for everybody. Obviously, I'm a teacher and a preacher, so I have to write it from that perspective. But a mum who's trying to teach her children, or a business person who's trying to communicate their vision to their team, or a sports coach who is trying to challenge their team to do the best in the forthcoming competition. Each one of us is involved in communication. So these are lots and lots of tips and tricks that I've learned about communication. And I tell people in the book that I was a terrible communicator. 50 years ago, I could not have imagined doing what I do.
Wow.
So I've had to learn the science of communication. And you say it's a big book, but actually it's 20 big ideas. So you can actually read it just one big idea at a time, and there are all sorts of ideas.
I love how you give permission at the beginning too to skip around. Like, I never know if I need to read a book left to right, but you said it right away, like, you can read this in whatever order you want. So I chose to read first and last, and then I kept bouncing back and forth till I met in the middle. And that was, I thought that was really freeing, that you give people permission to read it in a different way.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, look, I'm very aware that people are not readers. I love reading, so a big fat book doesn't faze me at all. You can see my bookshelf behind me. So I'm very happy with books, but I'm aware that some people don't. And even packaging it in one hit is going to put people off. But all you got to do, choose one chapter that you think you will benefit from, start there and think, oh, maybe there's some other things in this book that could help me.
That's so helpful.
Yeah, and even just as like you said, as a parent, or you said mum, I love that. Which I love. You always describe yourself as what? British by birth, Australian by choice, kingdom by birthright? What is
No, I say English by birth, Australian by choice, European by taste, kingdom by culture.
That's,
Ooh.
man, you're amazing.
That is so good.
Your voice too. People listening is like,
I know. So comforting.
It is very nice. It's like getting to hang out with C.S. Lewis or something.
No, but that's helpful for me, because I am in the category of I want to read, and Levi's in the category of he's like you, like he will read everything. He just loves it. For me, I do love it, but I'm at a season in my life where it's like, okay, I can maybe read one page here, or before this baby needs me, or whatever. And so that's so helpful, just knowing like, okay, pick one that maybe stands out most to you, that you need help with, and start there. That speaks to me and my lack of reading.
Look, I think if that's the case, I think that's great, because my wife talks about that when our children were little. All my children are now grown up, and I have 7 grandchildren. But when they were little, and she was desperately looking after her kids, she would put them in front of a program called Play School for 20 minutes. I don't know if you have a similar thing. And she would literally run up to her bedroom and throw herself on her knees and pray like crazy for 15 minutes while she had this space. And I think that's what a lot of, mothers' lives are like. They're just very, very, frenetic, and you never know what diaper you're going to have to change next.
Exactly.
So you've just got to pick those snippets. But she's been looking at the book again and rereading it. And she said, one of the things that I love is the tips at the end of the book, end of each chapter. Just she said to me yesterday, I want to go and do that. You've given me some tips and I want to go and put them into practice. So
Yeah.
That's so
The format's
good.
very cool because at the beginning of every chapter, you give like what you tell us, what you're going to tell us, and you give a synthesis of where it's all going to go. And then you do end every single chapter with some very actionable things that people can do that will lead to easy benchmarks that they'll actually see themselves growing as communicators. And I think that it's very cool.
Yeah.
You introduce early on, after you give your own autobiography where you're a squirrel. So this is just, people are like hearing this like, wait, what? Yes, that's true. I love that. I love the salt shaker story. The salt shaker fell in the ocean, and this is how we have a salty earth. Very funny. But then you tell the story of your life as told through a squirrel who had to flee a rat-like squirrel. But then after that's done, and I'm not going to spoil any more for people, but you lay out the 5 elements of a story, and they're an acrostic based on the word story. So tell us about those 5, because those become key, and you come back to those again and again and again. So explain those 5, STORY.
okay, well, quickly, let me just explain about the squirrel, because people may be thinking, who is this strange person? But my father had red hair. And so when he went to school, he was called Squirrel. And I went to the same school. So I was actually literally called Squirrel at school. In fact, I have a letter from my headmaster saying, Dear Squirrel. It was just a normal part of my life. And so many of the little things that happened to the squirrel in the first chapter of the book have literally happened to me.
Wow.
So that's why I tell the story. And
Chuck it. Chuck it.
That's right.
It's very funny. My kids
Anyway,
will enjoy that. Yeah.
So there are lots of, when you read stories, and there are lots of books on how stories work, but a lot of people talk about a story arc, which includes the 5 or 10 or 15 episodes in a different story. It depends on the book. But a classic story arc talks about 5 things. It talks about the hero or heroine in the story starts at home, is called to an adventure, goes on a journey of discovery, reaches a goal, and then returns home. So you've got home, call, discovery, goal, return. That is
And you show how that's in cinema, that's in The Hobbit, that's,
absolutely.
Yeah. It's the hero's journey. It's the hero's journey.
It's the hero's journey. So Peter Rabbit, written by Beatrix Potter, that's the story. Or Simba in The Lion King, that is the story. So
You said home, call, discovery, goal, return.
Return.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yep.
So Simba is called, he's living at home. He's called to an adventure to become king by a mentor, in his case, Rafiki. He goes on a journey of discovery where he learns who he is, learns what he can do, and makes lots of mistakes. And then he reaches his goal, which is to become king. And then it returns with that. Everything is returned back to normal, but with something better. In other words, the returning heroine or hero returns with something, a greater maturity. So
it's Luke Skywalker and Yoda on Dagobah, then back home. Yes.
absolutely exactly the same. Or the
Yep.
Hobbit in The Lord of the Rings. And every time the mentor comes in, knocks on the door, as soon as Gandalf knocks on the door, you know that Frodo or Bilbo's got to go on a journey of adventure. And the reason that it's like that is so that you and I, when we're reading books and watching movies, we immediately engage with the story. We know what's going on. We engage with the characters. Am I the hero? Am I the companion? Am I the baddie? Who am I in this story? And we relate to people. So I thought, well, I can preach like that. But rather than just call it home, call, discovery, goal, and return, I changed those 5 names to something that would make sense to me. STORY. Story. I tell a story, which is the big idea at home. I then create tension. That's the call aspect. I then talk about observations. That's the discovery aspect. Then revelation, the goal. And then what are you going to do about it? So basically, I'm following that format every time I preach. That's what I do. I tell it. So I've got a big idea. The big idea becomes the hero. I tell a story about that big idea in our real world. I then create a tension. Should I do this? Should I not do it? That tension, the knock on the door. And then I go on a journey of like undergirding truth, what we need to know, like what does this idea require? And then the goal, which comes about 4/5 through the message, this is the big idea. And then at the end, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, wow.
Wow.
It's incredible. And you actually think through your sermon in that grid, regardless of whether you're preaching topically or textually, or you want to kind of have your messages follow that arc.
Yeah, and look, the advantage, of course, if you're a coach, I had a coach write to me just a few days ago saying they're a netball coach and they use it just to encourage their kids. So it's a very simple, and you don't have to have it all written down either, because we know the story instinctively.
Right.
So I tell a story, I create tension. So let's say I'm talking about healing. I could say, I've been healed. So that's my story. That's a story of healing. Then I'd say, but of course, not everybody does get healed.
Tension.
So there's the tension. So here are 3 things that you need to know about healing, including healing is a mystery. But would you like to know how to get healed? Yes, that's the goal. And then, so what are you going to do about it?
Wow.
Ask for healing right now. Walk in faith. Yeah. Okay. Great. That's phenomenal.
Wow.
And it really is. It gives a cadence to it. It gives a goal to it. You compare preaching to jazz, and you talk about young preachers needing to learn the basics before they're ready to improvise. I thought that was a very helpful analogy.
Yeah, look, I'm not as I say, I'm not a musician, but my wife is a musician. So she has taught me a lot about music, even though it's not my first passion. And she learned classical music and then learned jazz. But because she learned the basic skills, she was able to improvise. If she didn't know the skills, she wouldn't be able to improvise. So it works like a railway or a train on a track. For a train to be itself and to be free, it has to be restricted. So you've got to submit to the rules before you're able to break them.
Beautiful.
Good.
Yes.
So that's jazz preaching, is learn the basics and then you're free to act.
Yeah. You
So
don't get to break the rules. Yeah.
Yeah, I say to my students, do not do what I do. Partly because you can't, because I've been doing this for 45 years and you have no idea what you're doing. But secondly, it won't help you. I'm going to teach you what you need to do, and then you can learn how to do it yourself.
Wow.
It's fantastic. And that's applicable whether you're giving a presentation or a book report, anybody who has to communicate for anything, how important story is. You quote Chip and Dan Heath in Made to Stick on just how important story is to business. So someone listening to this right now is like, hey, that's great, guys, but I'm not a preacher. But really, everything does come back to storytelling. If you work at Burger King, the story of the meal, it's key to every area of life, isn't it?
Absolutely. Look, if you're a business person, and I'm sure there are business people watching this or listening to this, one of the things that I do, many years ago, I read a book called Hooked, written by 2 business women who said, instead of giving your job description, give your story. So you're on a plane. Someone says, what do you do? I usually say, well, I'm a teacher or I'm a preacher. But if you say I'm a preacher, that immediately stops the conversation. So
they apologize. They apologize for all the salty language up until that point. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So what I do is tell a story. And it could be your own story of how you became a Christian, or it could be just a story to describe your job description. So, for instance, as you know, at Hillsong Church, one of the things that I do is to check the lyrics. So we put out hundreds of songs, but they're not allowed to be published unless they've been through on Amanda and my desk. We check them and we say no or yes, depending on what the lyrics are. So we're called the lyric police. So people say, well, what do you do? Well, and I say quality control. But if you say to someone, I'm a quality controller, that means nothing to anybody. That's, again, the end of the conversation. But if you tell a story about quality control, then suddenly people are intrigued. So I've often said to people, when they say, well, what do you do? And I said, well, I work in a church, but before I tell you what that involves, let me tell you a story. And then I say, there is a guitar manufacturer in Australia. It takes 6 weeks to make a handmade guitar. But at the end of the 6 weeks period, before it gets labeled and put on sale, an outsider, someone paid by the company, comes in and plays the guitar. If he says no, then the guitar gets discarded or destroyed. I said, I am the man who breaks guitars.
That's amazing.
So as soon as
Great.
people say, oh, tell me more.
Yeah. Wow.
I love that.
Gosh. So a lot of people listening even now, it's like, oh, wow. So they didn't realize they've seen your fingerprints, even if they didn't know it, because in their church they sang Oceans, or they enjoyed What a Beautiful Name, or any of the Hillsong Young and Free songs. And it's pretty cool that you have a part to play, even though you, like you've said multiple times, you're not musical. We've been all blessed by songs that you've had a hand in bringing to life.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what a privilege, because lots of our amazing people in our world are creative. Many of them are professional songwriters, and yet we will have emails backwards and forwards. Can I use this word? Can I use this line? And we say yes or no. Now, many of them are just brilliant, and therefore we don't need to check anything. But occasionally they'll say something that is not, we can't prove that biblically, or it's not Hillsong, or it's just unclear. So we're looking for journey, poetry, clarity. And if something doesn't fit those things, theology, we say no. And it's just a privilege because they submit to that process.
It's beautiful.
Wow.
That theological review step, so important. So even just for some churchmen, it's like, just because something sounds pretty or is right doesn't mean it's true. And it really is important that the responsibility to be putting these songs in the lips of God's people, that they match up to the truth of what God has self-disclosed through his word. That's really important.
Yeah, well, I feel very honored. And for a local church in Australia to be have the influence we have through our songs is an act of grace. I think every church has got a particular ministry. One of our challenges, both personally and corporately, is we're always trying to compete or compare ourselves with other people. Individuals are individuals, and they should discover who they are themselves. Every individual has a track, has a path to follow, has a gift. Every church has a track, a path, and a gift. And we shouldn't be comparing ourselves with other churches or other businesses or other people. We should be finding our own path and fulfilling our God-given task. Not an excuse for individuality, quite the opposite. It's actually an excuse for the body of Christ to work together properly. One person is an eye, one person is a hand. The eye needs the hand needs the eye, the head needs both. And if we can get that right, instead of competing and comparing and feeling bad because we're not as good as anyone else, we will discover our role in life.
Wow, that would change so much if we could all have that perspective. Because I think so often, especially with social media and Instagram, where you see other churches or other people doing all these things that you feel like, oh man, we need to do that, or we need to do this. And there's just, it restricts you because it keeps you from doing what God's called you to do and walking in the track and the lane that God's called you to. And so that is just so freeing, I'm sure, for people listening.
Yeah, and I use a phrase in the book that changed my life many years ago. There's a famous 18th century French preacher called Jean-Baptiste Massillon, and he said, I shall not preach like them. And he was looking at the other great preachers in his world and said, I'm not like that. So I don't try and be like our global senior pastor, Brian Houston. I'm not him. What I'm trying to follow is Jesus in him.
Yeah.
But by following Jesus in him, I become who I'm meant to be.
Wow.
But we've got loads of people in the world who are trying to copy everyone else. We've got an enemy who is a copier. God is a creator. If you copy God or you follow God, you're going to be different. If you follow the enemy, you're going to be the same.
Wow.
Yeah, you quote in the book one of my favorite statements about good preaching, that it's truth poured through personality.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of young preachers, you don't. You when you watch them, you can tell who they were inspired by. You can tell who they listened to, because it's almost like a clone. Like even the way they dress, the cadence to it, which, to some degree, I give a little bit of grace, because I think, until you learn your own style, there is a safety in, patterning yourself after your heroes, to a sense. I grew up, I would rip off Pastor Greg Laurie's sermons and almost preach them verbatim, and then eventually you kind of find your own sound. And I think the permission and safety, and maybe this is back to the jazz analogy, that there comes a point when you kind of jump off the cliff and go for it, of discovering who God made you uniquely to be. And for you, I remember the first time Jennie and I ever listened to you, and we'll talk about that day more, because Jennie talks about that in her book, and it means a lot to us as a family, that story. But listening to you preach, you were preaching on Ezekiel's vision and the wind, and when God gives breath back, and the way that you talked about the biology, and you took a lot of time to talking about flesh and bone and heart and breathing, and it's a very unique. It's a very unique approach, but it works for you because it's what you're interested in. It's how you see the world. And I relate to that because I'm very nerdy as well. I love history. You had me at this, what does the Vatican smell like? Or the Sistine Chapel. What does the Sistine Chapel smell like? But what does it smell like? I'm like, dang it. I love that. But not everybody has their own things that they're passionate about, and believing that God can pour his truth through our different personalities is very liberating.
Look, I think, and also what you're highlighting there is that it's a process. When you start off, you follow other people. Paul said, whatever I do, you do, and God will be with you. We are told to imitate our leaders and look at the fruit in their lives. But ultimately, that enables us to become the people we are. And it's going to take time. People get frustrated because God doesn't answer their prayer immediately, or God doesn't fulfill their desires in the first 2 years of their Christian life. Well, I've been doing this for 45 years, and I'm still learning, and I'm still haven't seen some prayers answered.
Wow.
And I'm still excited about the future. It's a process, and it's a lifelong journey of adventure and discovery. In fact, there's a whole chapter in the book on discovery, because it's such an important thing. We set out on this journey of discovery, and it's just a beautiful thing. Every day has got new lessons, new excitements, new challenges, new opportunities. And if we have that attitude to life, instead of life being black and white and boring, and it's going to become colorful.
I like how when you talk in the book about how people ask you after a good sermon, how long did it take you to write that? And you say 45 years. It took your whole life experience to get there, to get to that moment.
Yeah. And it's not just, if I were as interested in golf, and I say this in the book, you shouldn't be telling everybody about golf because that's your passion. But it's my mother had what I call a gift of curiosity. And she gave me that gift. She said, everything is interesting. You should be interested in everything.
Wow.
So you shouldn't just talk about your one or two real interests. It's just you should have this broad brushstroke, this perspective of life, that artists are interesting, musicians are interesting, scientists are interesting, places are interesting, people are interesting. And if you can incorporate all of that in your messages, then the nerds will like you, the scientists will like you, the artists will like you. And it's not about liking you, it's listening or hearing what you've got to say.
Right.
And how important it is to have your ending in mind. I thought that was particularly helpful. That a lot of preaching you hear, it's like, man, they had a great opening. They got going as they were, cooking with the midst of the message, but then it just falls apart at the ending. And it really is important to have. You talk about going through a home that you plan your entrance, but you also you plan your ending. You know how you're going to end.
Yeah, I often think if I were praying for people at the end of this message, what would I pray? Because that gives me an insight into what are they going to go away with. Our senior pastor, global senior pastor, Brian Houston, always teaches us in Hillsong. He says, preach to people's Mondays.
Yeah, right.
And I talk about that in the book. What are they going to take away? And going back to what we said about stories, people come to me literally 20, 30, 40 years after they heard me preach, and they retell in detail a story that I told them 40 years ago. Wow. And they said, that changed my life. And I'm thinking, I'm not even sure I can remember that story, but that's the power of story. They've been impacted and they've taken it away and they've applied it. Well, that for me is the test of a good message. How many times, you guys, you've preached and someone's talking to you in the fire, and this has happened to all of us, and you say to someone, and I do this regularly, so what did you take away from that? And they look at me blankly. They can't remember a thing about what I said.
Totally.
Yeah.
And it's depressing. But that's what we want to change.
So it's preaching for the Monday, not for the Sunday. Very good. What kind of a system do you have? Because obviously I related very much to the moment where you were about to preach your sermon, but you just didn't have that opening illustration. You were running around like crazy until the light bulb went off about Napoleon crowning himself instead of the Pope crowning him, and that's phenomenal. But there has to be some sort of a system for retrieval. To read widely. But do you use Evernote? Do you write stuff down? How do you archive these illustrations that you come across and go, man, that's going to be great. I just don't know for what, but I need a system to keep it or I can't have it for later.
Good question.
Well, look, this is a great question. This may sound really strange, but bear with me. I have friends who write down all their stories and they just record them all, lists and lists and lists of stories. I never do that. I have a very, very visual memory, and I can see myself in places. And when I'm telling a story, I put myself in my mind back into that place and then describe it as I'm seeing it. Now, there's danger in that. You forget little details, but because of the visual memory, I remember things. And I also want to choose the right story for the right occasion. And that's where in the book I talk about how the Holy Spirit helps to remind me of a mess or a story that's going to speak into somebody's life. So I'll often choose a story randomly in the middle of my message. I'll just say, I've got this point from the Bible and I want to illustrate it. So let me tell you a story. And I tell the story and people come up to me afterwards and said, you have no idea how accurate or pertinent or appropriate that story was. But I didn't have it in my notes. I just said it off the top of my head. So I think this is what makes the difference between preaching and public speaking. Public speaking is just someone's eloquence, their gift, their education, their genius. Preaching involves the work of the Holy Spirit.
Yes.
I cannot change lives. He can.
Yeah.
So let me give you a random example. Many, many years ago, I was reading a newspaper on my day off. And I just felt, and I believe by the Holy Spirit, to read the opera report in the newspaper. Now, remember, I don't like music. So why would I do that on my day off? But I just felt immensely prompted to read this opera report. And it was comparing two productions of Bizet's Carmen, one in England, Australia. So it was very technical. And as I finished it, the phone rang. And someone who had been in church the day before rang me and said, I've got your number and I want to talk to you about your message. I was a bit cross because it's my day off and how did they get my number? what's going on here? And I said, well, before I talk to you about Jesus, could I ask you what you do for a living? And he said, I'm a professional opera singer.
Jeez.
No way.
So I said, well, what do you think of the performance in the Sydney Opera House recently? And how do you think it compares with the one in Glyndebourne in England a few weeks ago? And we had this conversation about opera for 15 minutes. And then when my information ran out, I led him to Jesus.
Jeez.
Oh my God.
And then the following year, he was in Bible college.
Well, there you go.
Wow.
That reminds me about when we had Pastor Jensen on the podcast, and we asked him about his prayer life, because he talks about going around with a pocket knife cutting trees, and they signify prayers, and it was a really cool thing. But one of the things he said he prays every day, and I've never thought to pray this, but I have since, is, God, would you put the right information in front of me? He said there's so many books, so many articles, so he prays every day that I pray the right things would cross my computer, would cross my desk. And that's just kind of a cool thing. Like you put in the book, the prayer of Jabez, you talk about kind of had that mentality of increase my land, and kind of that believing that the Holy Spirit is going to, I tell people similarly, like follow weird, quirky passions, and don't worry if it doesn't apply today, because it might be 5 years from now.
Look, I mean, you can see that I love books, but I go into big bookshops around the world, and people say, how do you know what to buy or what to read? I say, again, this may sound strange, a book finds me. And I will look around the bookshop, and then I'll walk straight across the bookshop, look up on a third shelf, pull down a book, and it just speaks to me in my situation. So I totally agree with Jensen. That's what I do. We can't read all the books in the world, even though I'd like to, but I choose the right books, and so many times it's just worked for me.
Yeah, wow. It's one of my, I don't know if I've ever said this publicly, if I get stuck and I can't figure out a new message series, or if I'm trying to come up with a new series, sometimes I'll just go to the library and just wander around and pick up random titles. And sometimes even just the title, it might not be that, but it might jug my thoughts. Like one time, one book, I was like, that's incredible. I scanned it to look at it on Amazon, and Amazon said, if those who like that, like this. And it was that kind of hopscotch that led me to one of my favorite message series ever. Actually, a message that I gave last time I was out at Hillsong called Blood and Thunder, but it came from a book about the dispossessing of land of Native Americans called Blood and Thunder. But it's like this little things like that. And I love the grand adventure of following Jesus and just knowing you can follow the whimsy a little bit there.
Look, I've done a message in the past. I'd love to write about it one day, but called the theology of coincidence. And I based this idea that God actually is sovereign, and therefore he works all things together for good. And he just works things in our favor. And if we're walking in his path, we'll bump into the right people, we'll bump into the right books, we'll, as you say, have the right information in front of us. And coincidences, or what I call God incidents, happen to me all the time. I mean, ridiculous things. Sometimes you have no idea what it means. You just have to believe. It's almost like, the way I describe it, it's like God taking me across a park and giving me an ice cream. But not because I need it, and not because he loves me, but because he just likes the idea of giving me an ice cream, just like we do with our children. And I almost imagine him in heaven thinking, oh, Robert's going to love this. And I'm walking into a bookshop or walking through a park, and I see something, and I think, that is unbelievable. And God's just sort of chuckling to himself in heaven, saying, I knew he would like that. I knew he would like that.
Oh, I love that so much. That's so beautiful.
It's beautiful. Now I have to ask before we turn and I mean, I can't stress enough how much I want people listening to read this book. Yeah. Are you getting this? You got to grab it. Get it on Amazon. Get it on Kindle. Do you read the book yourself on Kindle, on Audible rather?
No, I recorded it all myself. Yes, but I've hardly ever read an Audible book in my life or listened to it. So I'm not. I like a real book in my hand. But yes, I did record it myself.
Oh, good.
14 hours, I think.
Oh, gosh.
Were you surprised by how hard that was?
Unbelievably hard. It's really, it's not just difficult because you're saying the words accurately, but it's just the energy you put in is huge.
Yes.
You would know that.
Fatiguing
Yeah.
like crazy, and you have to hold so still because the little person in the other booth will say, "Oops, sorry, we heard your clothing rustling or your teeth
Or
clicking."
your stomach rumbling. That was one of my things because I was missing my lunch to do it, and that wasn't a good idea.
Yeah, those voice actors don't get enough respect because that is legitimately hard work.
Yeah.
I'm so glad
Yeah.
you did it with your own voice, though. So those who, because I know a lot of
That's
people listening,
special.
they're saying, "Hey, I don't have time to read a 400-page book." Well, you can throw it on Audible and listen and hear
Absolutely.
Robert's voice in your ears. And I wonder I wonder what speed I would need to listen to you at. I don't think I would be able to do double speed. I think it would be probably 1.5 speed. When you listen to audiobooks, do you speed it up?
He said he doesn't.
Oh, you don't
I
listen to
don't
Audible at all?
audiobooks, so, but to be honest, it's. I'm sure you're the same. When you hear your own voice recorded back, it always sounds a little higher
Yeah.
than it does because it's not resonating through your own head. So as soon as you speed it up, it sounds even higher. So I think I'd probably slow it down a bit.
Yeah, gosh, so good.
Well, it's so funny because Levi will listen to it like you'll listen to things at
Double
two,
speed is normal. It's just there's so much, like you said, there's so much to read.
But I feel like I need every word, and so whenever I listen to something with him, it loses me because I can't keep up with the speed of it. So I usually
I put YouTube videos on double speed. Everything's always a little bit stepped up. Then I can slow back down. But my favorite thing these days, like if I'm really enjoying a book, if I have it on the Audibles, I'll get the Kindle too. And now Kindle has this feature where if you're reading it on Kindle, you can push play on the audio and the words highlight as it goes down. So you can read and listen at the same time. And that is really nice for some somewhat dry material. It livens it up a little bit.
Look, my wife reads Kindle a lot, and on planes, and most of the time she's reading Kindle. But I need a physical book, and I was reading a book recently called "Stop What You're Doing and Read This," and there was a chapter in there that compared Kindle to going to the supermarket and buying vegetables, or reading a real book is like having your own backyard where you're growing your own vegetables. And they said the vegetables, if the content is exactly the same, but he said you don't ever want to hang out in a supermarket.
That's true.
right.
So
Yeah.
that's how I can.
I agree. There's nothing like the pages in your hand and the ink and the smell and the whole vibe and being able to
Yeah.
underline stuff. But there is an incredible power in being able to copy and paste. As an author, to be able to copy and paste citations and not have to, whatever. I think I do it all. I listen, I read, I get them all. I think the key is read.
Yeah.
I had some young men on my staff in my office. I'm going through a small group with them, and one of them said, "I'm ashamed to admit I've only ever finished 2 books in my entire life." And I was like, "Please tell me one of them was mine." And he's like, "Sadly, no." So I was like, man, I've really failed.
Yeah.
But just how important to you is it for the next generation, just the power of reading?
Well, not only because of the information that I think is essential, but I actually think it helps people slow down and to actually presence themselves in a very real sense. I am going to engage with this person if it's a biography of this or this information. And I think that is important in itself. And there's the other thing about books is that people say that you don't read books, books read you.
Wow.
And
Wow.
so when we're reading books, they tell us about ourselves. And I think that alone is worth reading books for. So when I'm challenging or mentoring people, I always say, at the very least, as a leader, you should be reading 1 book every month. That's the goal that I would set for people. As you say, some people haven't ever read 1 book in a year or in a lifetime, but 1 book a month is reasonable. I try and read at least a book a week and often much more.
Wow.
We are kindred spirits.
Yes,
But that
you
is a
guys
very
are.
attainable goal. I mean, if you read 3 or 4 pages a day, you can finish a book in a month. I mean, that's no low bar.
Yeah, and I think
Low bar,
that's
but I think you've got to set the bar low sometimes because people are incredibly, or they're using the excuse of being incredibly busy.
Yeah.
But when you actually look at their lives, they're not incredibly busy. They're just filling it with stuff that they don't need to fill it with.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think also, having a goal like that, like I'm going to finish this book in a month, I feel like that kind of puts the fire under you a little bit to read with more energy and expectation and getting more out of it, because then there's an end to it. Because I think sometimes I'll start a book and I just like, I'll just kind of like float through, where if I were like, hey, I'm going to read this in a month, then that I could even plan, like I'm going to read 3 chapters in this week or whatever. Like I feel like that is so helpful and so attainable.
Absolutely. And when you think about just the what it does for, like you said, for your soul, for your mind, for your, for the relaxation aspects of it, it's powerful.
Yeah.
And I think you've got to work. If people are struggling with disciplines, what I say to them is, what do you do every day that you will always do? And they say, well, I always have breakfast, let's say, or I'll always go for a run, or whatever their disciplines are. And I say, well, connect what you don't do with what you do. If you eat breakfast every day, well, why don't you read for 5 minutes before breakfast, or read your Bible before breakfast, or pray before breakfast? In other words, attach what you don't do to what you do.
Wow.
And little by little, you create all these rhythms. And one of the things that I love is that I love lists, and I hate not finishing something. So one of the things that I do is that when I finish a book, I will write it in a list. These are the books that I've read this year, and I'll write the author, the publisher, the year, and a comment about it. So that, and I'm not allowed to put it in the list unless I finished it.
I love that.
And so it's just, what I've done is, I don't like, I struggle to finish a difficult book, but I will finish it because I've got to put it in the list. So I've attached it to what I love and what I do. So I think everybody can do that. You may not be a list taker, or you may be a good finisher, but it doesn't really matter. Connect what you don't do and would like to with what you already do. As soon as you do that, you're going to find yourself much more disciplined.
That's life-changing.
Well, you do the same thing. I mean, Jennie does her journaling every night before bed, and she's going to go to bed every night. So if there's always a journal on the nightstand, I always see her before I'm usually asleep as she finishes, but she's almost always journaling just in the last few minutes before falling asleep. So like you said, it's attaching it to something that's always going to be in the schedule and making a habit out of it.
Yeah. And once you've done that for a few weeks, it becomes a rhythm. So now I cannot not journal. And there's a chapter in my book called Coming In and Going Out. I can't not do it. It would be like not getting dressed in the morning. I would feel so uncomfortable. Because
I actually wrote that down as my favorite chapter in the book, journaling, because you talk about the prayer, the blessed are you as you come in, blessed are as you go out, and you connect that to journaling. Just unpack that for a moment.
Wow.
Look, the phrase coming in and going out is used throughout the scriptures. We'll be blessed in our coming in and going out. It's just an expression. But Jesus in John chapter 10 talks about that he is the door of the sheepfold, and people will come in and go out through him. And that whole image of the sheepfold, in fact, in my television program, What Do You See? I've actually illustrated that to show how sheep literally go in and out through or past the shepherd. And I just have connected that rhythm to our normal life, that the disciples every day had to come to Jesus, and then they went out from Jesus. That's all that they did. They came to him, came into him, and out from him. And all I've done is look in the book about how we can create that rhythm, like breathing in our life, that just becomes a normal part of my life. So in my journal, every day I come into Jesus, write down what God says to me, and then I go out for him and I write down what I'm going to say for him.
And that overflow drives messages, drives life, drives the Mondays. That's really great.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, we have to talk about the circumstances under which we met, because speaking of the coincidence and God's sovereignty, Pastor Robert, you came into our lives at a very, very, very special and important time. And I mean, we're both profoundly grateful
Yeah.
for what you were used to deposit into our lives.
Yeah, well, we've gotten to tell you in person this, but I just want it for our listeners to hear too of just how special you are to me personally and to us as a family, but just how we so happened to be in New York, and you so happened to be there preaching while we were there, and again, I mean, I look back and I open my journal to when I took notes from your message and just how God was speaking to me so greatly through what you were preaching. But then we got to meet and you just took a moment to speak over us. But then that night we came back to church and I actually wanted to go see a play, but
I convinced her. I dragged her to
he's
church.
like, let's just go to church. But that night really changed me. And you were preaching the word, but then you took a moment at the end to speak. It was a time of waiting on the Lord, you said it was. And it was a time of worship. And then you just took a moment to speak over a few people in the room and speak to a few people in the room. And I love it because you spoke to me. And I love how you said, I remember
singled her out,
you
yeah.
singled me out and you said, and you don't know me from a bar of soap. And Levi, I'm not speaking to you. I'm speaking to your wife. And you just started prophesying over me and speaking God's love over me. And little did we know that 8 days later, our second-born daughter, Lenya, would die of an asthma attack. And some of the things that you spoke over me that night were things that God used for me to hold on to of his
Like
love.
a life raft.
Like a life raft. And so, I mean, you've just been so special to me since that, but I'm just so grateful for you and how you do preach the word and how you do take a moment to speak life over people and allow the Holy Spirit to speak through you. And so again, I'm so thankful for you and my life and our lives, and that you would even take the time to get up an hour early and spend time with us today as well. But we love you.
Well, to be honest, I love you guys, and I feel very humbled every time you tell that story, and immensely grateful to God, because I've always been immensely encouraged by people speaking words of encouragement, words of prophecy over me. And I made a decision 40 or so years ago that I would always try and do that for other people. And so, as you said, in that meeting, I didn't know you, but I spoke a word of encouragement that proved to be incredibly important to you. And I don't know if you remember this, but after speaking to you, and I remember 3 times in the middle of my message being compelled to encourage you. And then the next day, we bumped into each other randomly in a cafe in New York. Well, that's a God incident. And I was able to reiterate what I'd encouraged you the day before.
Yeah.
And only God knows what was going on in those circumstances. I don't begin to know. But I felt just to encourage you. And thankfully, that word of encouragement proved to be something on which you could hold in
Yes.
the traumatic and tragic and frightening days that followed.
Yeah, and it's not, to me, watching, Jennie was at the start, in my opinion, at that moment of a journey of discovery of her own calling. And, obviously we serve together, but God, I believe, has a unique hand on her life. And one of the great things about Jennie is that she, like Saul, will tend towards hiding among the equipment. She's not going to be the one putting herself out there. She's happy to serve in the background. She's always a great champion and cheerleader of other people. But I feel like that night was the start of God beginning to show that besides being Levi's wife, that God has a very unique individual call and platform for Jennie to occupy, and for her to not be afraid to walk in that grace. And I'm so, as a husband, grateful for the beginning. And there's been multiple different moments. Pastor Louis Giglio, another time, singled her out and spoke a word of a new season. And I've just really watched the confirmation of those sorts of words like you gave to her that night, of God just beginning to raise the volume on her life. And it's just been, I'm just so indebted to you for your faithfulness in just that, taking that moment.
Yeah.
Well, I can relate to Jennie because I am that person that hides behind the baggage, and I don't want to be in a public place at all. I don't even like crowds very much. So I know that needed those words of encouragement to say you can do it, Robert. And so if I've been party to help you do that, I fully understand that. And I thankfully have been the recipient of other people's encouragement who've told me that I can do it. And so if it's helped you to step out into the fullness of your ministry, so that's an honor to me. And look, I didn't do what I have done with other people. A friend of mine, I was in London and I just stopped in the middle of my message and I called him up onto the platform. So you would have been terrified if I'd done that. And then I
Thank you for not doing that.
yeah, I prophesied over him on the platform and I said, I'm calling you up because this is your future.
Wow.
And he tells me, 20 years later, he's leading a great church. And it was that moment that enabled him to do what he does today. So, yeah, we all need those moments in time where God sees us.
Yes.
And we know that he sees us. He sees us in our potential. He sees us in our pain. He sees us in our situation. And it's just that I see you and I see your future.
Gosh,
That's beautiful.
it's incredible. Well, before we go, I do have to ask you, you quote in the book, Are You Getting This? Winston Churchill's Never Give In speech at Harrow College. You also refer to my favorite Winston Churchill speech, the Blood, Sweat, and Tears address. Although I do love the We Fight 'Em on the Beaches, because have you heard the quip that I guess off microphone, the moment he finished we'll fight him on the beaches, we'll fight him in the shores, blah, blah. Yeah. As the crowd roared, he leaned off, he covered the microphone up and leaned to his friends there and said, and we'll have to fight him with broken bottles, because that is pretty well all we have, because England was broke at the time.
Yeah.
But what is your favorite? Obviously, you're British, so I'm not worthy to even bring up the great Winston Churchill in your presence. But what's your favorite Churchill story or era or phase?
Well, I don't know if you've noticed, but just behind me on my bookshelf is the history of the Second World War, and I've got lots of his other books as well.
Wow.
I don't know if you know, but my grandfather was his personal private secretary.
Stop.
No.
And he
gosh.
worked very closely. So we have letters from Churchill to my grandfather and vice versa, because he worked for him. So in one of the films, you see him sitting in a bath and his secretary, dictating notes. I don't know if you remember one of the...
That was the newest one, The Darkest Hour.
Yeah. All right. So he would dictate notes. Well, my grandfather would actually go into the bathroom, sit on the edge of the bath, and Churchill would dictate a letter to him as he's sitting on the edge of the bath. So, yeah, I've got personal stories about Winston Churchill, not just generic ones.
My gosh. Okay. Well, what's your favorite thing about it? I need it now. This podcast is never ending. Now we're going to talk about the Boer War to start. That was really intriguing to me to find out he was a prisoner of war, made it on foot through South Africa, it's just some crazy stuff.
I think, and I talk about this in the book, his father was incredibly unkind to him, sent him to a boarding school, and I went to a boarding school from the age of 7 to 18. I was put back a year, just like Churchill was put back a year. He was told that he couldn't achieve anything, couldn't express himself, and yet he goes on to become a Nobel Prize winning, in literature. And I had I'm not in his category at all, but I had a similar bad experience at school and was told that I was stupid, lazy, couldn't express myself in public. My geography essay was published in the school centenary magazine as the worst piece of writing in the school's history in the last 100 years. So for me to write a book is ridiculous. So I think I relate to that side of Churchill. I don't relate to a lot of his life. He wasn't a nice man in many areas, but I relate to the fact that despite his bad background, he managed to make something great and significant of his life.
Wow.
Gosh, that's great.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm a bit obsessed at the moment with the Battle of Britain and the whole Beaver Brook and the Minister of Aircraft Production. But knowing that your grandfather was his PA is pretty
Well,
BA.
look, he wasn't.
Sorry.
It was a government position, so he's a civil servant. He went on to lead one of the departments in the civil service, but it's called the personal private secretary. So it's not like a a typist. He was actually sent by the government to work with him.
Like an attaché kind of a thing.
That kind of thing. And look, since we're talking about authors and you've mentioned C.S. Lewis, I'm going to make you feel even more jealous because my father was at Oxford University and C.S. Lewis was his tutor.
Wow.
No way.
Casual name drops.
Wow.
Well, that explains it.
You
that explains it.
Churchill and Lewis, so I thought I'd just go.
Man, I really want to go.
Incredible.
What's the cottage he would write at that you can go to today in England?
Yeah, I can't remember it, to be honest.
It's got a name. You can go there and see like the little house he wrote at. And
Wow.
Yeah, really. What's your favorite Lewis book?
Look, my wife is passionate about Lewis and has read everything. She would describe C.S. Lewis as her mentor. I'm not quite as passionate. I think some of his quotes are extraordinary.
Yeah.
I think probably Mere Christianity is right up there in terms of the one that has impacted me the most.
Yeah, I would go Four Loves probably.
Yeah. There are aspects. I actually listened to an audiobook of C.S. Lewis reading the Four Loves.
Oh, yeah.
Back in the 50s or 60s, he recorded the Four Loves, and so I've heard his voice. So that's really interesting. But there were aspects of the Four Loves that really helped me. The difference between the four different loves and the way I loved his quote in the Four Loves about storge, the family affection being like a comfortable pair of slippers. I've often used that illustration when the real family affection is like a comfortable pair of slippers.
So good. Well, Robert Fergusson, thank you. My gosh, you're pretty much the coolest person ever, and I love talking to you. But we got to let you get on with your day there in Australia, and thank you for being in our lives and coming on the podcast today.
Thank you. We love you.
Well, I feel immensely honored, and I've loved talking with you, and I hope that our conversation encourages people in your world. So God bless you. God bless you.
All right. Are you getting this, Pastor Robert Fergusson? All right. Well, thank you so much, sir. Have a good day.